بشتغل هنا باحث في العدالة الجنائية، واحنا معانا النهارده زميل والصديق هاورد فارني من جنوب افريقيا. هو محامي دستوري ومحامي في حقوق الانسان، وبيشتغل كمان مستشار للمركز الدولي للعدالة الانتقالية ICTJ، وهو عنده خبرة تقترب يمكن من 20 سنة تحديدا في مجال العدالة الانتقالية، وفي تمثيل ضحايا انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، وخصوصا انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في عصر في الفصل العنصري في جنوب أفريقيا. هاورد كمان كان يعني ناشط في الحركة الوطنية ضد نظام الفصل العنصري بداية من الثمانينات، وليه خبرة كبيرة بالمجال العام والمجال السياسي. اشتغل في أكتر من حاجة متعلقة بلجنة الحقيقة والمصالحة، واشتغل على أكتر من لجنة للتحقيق في انتهاكات الشرطة ولمراقبة أداء الشرطة. بس هو دلوقتي تقريبا يعني متفرغ للشغل القانوني وشغل حقوق الإنسان، وهو كان جاي زيارة في مصر وتكرم إن هو يجي ويدينا يعمل النقاش العام ده. احنا طبعا النقاش ده كان الهدف منه إن احنا نعقد شوية الحديث عن مفاهيم الانتقال السياسي والانتقال الديمقراطي والعدالة الانتقالية، ونعقد شويه الصوره اللي هي في الاغلب بتبقى ورديه عن اللي حصل في جنوب افريقيا وتجربه العداله الانتقاليه في جنوب افريقيا. وهو ليه خبره طويله جدا في الموضوع ده، فانا هسيبه دلوقتي يتكلم، وبعد ما يتكلم هعلق تعليق سريع ونفتح.
To engage in this debate about transitional justice and the peculiar but interesting experience of South Africa. I thought of not speaking for too long, perhaps no more than about 30 minutes, because I think it'd be way more interesting to engage in questions and discussion and debate. Just going forward, that would on the one hand offer a stake in the political process to those excluded, but on the other hand would protect the political and most importantly the economic interests of his constituency, which was most of the white people in South Africa. And you've got to hand it to him, that's precisely what he did, and he did so rather successfully. White people today enjoy amongst the highest standard of living in the world, even though much of the country is in a state of deprivation, and many black people remain unemployed and poverty-stricken. But let's return to the negotiation process. I spoke about this larger package, and I think it's important to highlight a few of the mechanisms that we set up. There were multi-party talks, and those talks went on for a couple of years. I notice in Egypt, I don't want to do too many contrasts, but if I can make one observation, people in Egypt seem to be in quite undue haste, quite a rush to get things done, finalize agreements, get a constitution sorted and implemented. One can understand why that people are impatient, but if you look at South Africa, and I suspect South Africans are equally impatient people, if we had to mark a beginning of our transition, that would certainly be the 2nd of February, which marked the unbanning of the ANC and the other prohibited organizations, and the subsequent release of Nelson Mandela. The negotiations began a few months later in that year and really didn't conclude until the end of 1993. So when you count up those weeks and months, that's nearly 4 years of painstaking negotiation. I should tell you that the years of our transition, the years between 1990 and 1994, I'm not suggesting that our transition ended in 94, by the way, but 1994 was the year we held our first democratic elections. But that short period of time, some 4.5 years, marks the most violent and most brutal period of South Africa's modern history. I was involved in human rights monitoring at the time with different legal organizations and monitoring outfits, and we estimate that that roughly between 3,000 and 4,000 people were dying each year through ongoing political violence, through drive-by shootings, massacres, clubbings, knifings, etc. And here we're not counting normal criminal violence. We're only observing politically motivated violence. And so in those 4 odd years, 15 or more thousand people perished in terrible violence. And if you compare that with the preceding years, going all the way back to 1948, which many mark as the start of formal apartheid in South Africa, those 4 years were by far much more brutal and violent than all the years before combined. So can it really be said that our transition was a model transition to be emulated? I think we have to look a little more closely at what happened in those years. I recall those years with some horror, some trepidation, and a great deal of sadness. It certainly wasn't seamless. It certainly wasn't peaceful. It certainly was not straightforward. At the end of the day, however, the commitment to negotiate through people such as Nelson Mandela, through skillful people on both sides of the political spectrum, individuals such as Rudolf Meyer on the part of the Nationalist Party, Cyril Ramaphosa on the part of the African National Congress, who found it within themselves to find common ground, eventually helped us to find a path through the brutality. We put in place different mechanisms. After the breakdown of the multi-party talks, we then put together another set of negotiations. We agreed to set up a transitional executive council, which had executive power. Under that council, we set up a range of technical subcommittees, and we invited independent experts to sit on those committees. And those committees dealt with every single sector of society. It looked at how to reform different institutions, such as the security sector, the judiciary. It looked at law reform, constitutional reform. It looked at finance and a range of other activities. Out of that program, we agreed on a number of standards and principles. And ultimately, we brought those principles and values down to a number of 33 principles. And we said that whatever we do from now on, everything we do has to accord with those 33 principles, including the final constitution. But because we needed some ground rules to govern the transition, given how problematic it had been, we came up with an interim constitution which guaranteed fundamental rights and which ensured that minorities would not be discriminated pending a final constitution. Interestingly enough, that interim constitution, which took place, which was finalized in 1993, had a little document called a postscript that was attached to the back of that document. And it was that document that spoke of reconciliation, the need for national reconciliation. It spoke of the need for reparation as opposed to retribution. It spoke of the need to make sacrifices in order to cross the historic bridge from a past of oppression and brutality and violence to a future of democracy and the rule of law. And it specifically said that one of those sacrifices would be the need for a limited amnesty. So that then really set the framework for an important part of our transition going forward. And you may ask, why did we agree to these kinds of sacrifices? Why would we allow perpetrators of some of the most heinous crimes an opportunity to escape justice? And the fundamental reason was we were in a bind. We were looking for ways to secure the buy-in and commitment of all parties, and in particular the security elements to the process going forward. And frankly, they wanted certain assurances. They wanted certain guarantees that we would not go after them. And we were not willing to give those guarantees, but we had to come up with some kind of compromise to guarantee their buy-in. And we did want their buy-in because we knew they were capable of causing massive disruption. At the time, I was on a small committee that was investigating hit squads within one of the police forces. And our investigations revealed that right-wing elements in collaboration with the security forces had put together very substantial arms caches, including tens of thousands of limpet mines, artillery, rockets, and so on and so forth. We concluded that they had the capability to engage in insurrection that could last for decades and that could potentially destroy the country. And in fact, I reported this in a submission to the Transitional Executive Council, and I said we either need to deal with these individuals in a security manner, or we need to engage in some kind of political action to neutralize them. And so that was the kind of context that we were dealing with, and we decided that we did have to make certain compromises. This compromise is often called the middle way. Archbishop Tutu is famous for talking about the third way. He said, on the one hand, we did not want to engage in Nuremberg-type trials in which we hold everybody before a public hearing. But on the other hand, we didn't want to engage in collective amnesia or a blanket wall-to-wall amnesty. And so the middle way was this truth for amnesty. Those that came forward and disclosed the full truth would be given an immunity from criminal prosecution, but also civil action as well. We really believed that this particular compromise was necessary at the time. There was another compromise that the government at the time wanted, and that was job security. Nobody wanted to be fired from their position simply because they were associated with the former oppressive regime. And I know this is certainly an issue that is faced by many countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, is what to do about individuals who have belonged to a ruling party that was corrupt and engaged in oppressive rule. And again, we took a pragmatic approach, and we called it the Sunset Clause, or at least that was the name given to it by a senior member of the South African Communist Party. That compromise said that nobody would be dismissed or fired or demoted without good cause, and certainly not because anybody belonged to a particular political party or happened to be in a particular position. So everybody's jobs were guaranteed at least until the next, or rather the second general election. So 5 years of job security was introduced. So we then had to live with everybody occupying their current posts. This didn't mean, of course, that we couldn't engage in some institutional reform, and certain individuals were transferred into other positions, but with the same seniority and full benefits. All right, let's take a look at some of the mechanisms of the transition. And perhaps I'll start with the most famous one, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I suspect an audience of this nature probably is quite familiar with what happened. The commission was set up to search for the truth, to make findings about the past violations, and to make recommendations to prevent the repeat of those violations, and also recommendations for the redress or recompense for the harm suffered by many thousands of victims. In many respects, that commission was reasonably successful. It had a very expansive mandate. It had to look at what had taken place between 1960 and 1993. And as you're all aware, those were some of the worst years of apartheid. Some 73,000 individuals were detained without trial. Countless numbers were tortured. Many disappeared. Several million were forcibly displaced, simply on grounds of their colour. And of course, there was massive social and economic discrimination. As mentioned, the commission was, in fact, the only commission in the world that had the power to grant amnesty on the basis I've described, namely truth for amnesty. More than 7,000 perpetrators applied for amnesty. More than 5,000 were rejected. Around 800 applications were withdrawn, and in the end, about 845 of the applications were actually granted. So as you can see from this interesting setup, it wasn't premised entirely on impunity. It was more of a carrot and stick approach. The carrot being the grant of immunity, so long as the full truth was disclosed. If the full truth was not disclosed, there was meant to be some kind of consequence, some kind of follow-up. And that's why a system like this rests on a coherent justice policy. It means that you need to have strong investigative capacity, you need to have strong prosecutorial capacity, and of course you need to have independent judiciary as well. And of course you need the political will to in fact go through with your design, your promise to make good on the compromises that were made. All right, let's make a quick assessment of the results of what took place. I've spoken about the amnesty. The truth-seeking was not entirely coherent, but I think it is true to say that much was done. Hearings were held in all parts of the country. Hundreds of victims were given a voice. Many came and testified publicly. Nearly 20,000 statements were taken from victims and witnesses. Hundreds of interviews were held. Many of those interviews were behind closed doors. I think quite good policy was generated in terms of reparations. I think the Commission can be described as independent. Most of the commissioners were credible and independent people. Some of them had a strong human rights track record. What many people don't know is that the Commission also had independent monitoring. That was an offer made by the international community and accepted by the Commission. And we had experienced individuals from overseas police forces and human rights organizations who sat with the Commission from start to end. They had unhindered access to all our documents, all our investigations, without exception. And they then wrote confidential reports both to the Commission and to their respective governments. And we believe that kind of monitoring helped us, one, to remain as professional as possible, but also to remain as objective as we possibly could. The report was issued in October of '98. It was a 5-volume report comprising some 2,500 pages. I believe that the essential story was placed on the table. I also believe that certain important perpetrators were fingered or named and their roles exposed. I should have added that our commission had certain powers that many commissions don't have, which is investigative teeth. They had the power to subpoena individuals, force them to testify, force them to come to the commission with documents, and if they don't, they committed a criminal offence and could go to jail. The commission also had power to get search orders from courts for inspections and searches, and they could even seize documents under law. And from time to time, those investigative powers were used to good effect. The Commission was also reasonably successful in tracing some remains of missing people, but of course many they didn't find. They were not particularly successful in investigating the role of the military. The military used various means and techniques to shield their role. The Commission has been criticised for adopting too much of a case-by-case approach. Although, to be fair to them, their mandate did require them to investigate cases of gross human rights violations. But this meant that they were so busy investigating so many cases that they weren't able to spend too much time investigating the deeper structural causes. And that's where I think they can be justly criticised. The strength, however, was the participatory process of that commission. Most of the hearings were held in public, and that made an important break from earlier truth commissions where hearings were not public. Unless the commission was dealing with children or sexual violations or confidential sources, the hearings were all public. They were often broadcast live. Every Sunday we had a television program that would recap the previous week's events. And so in that way, the public got involved in what was going on, and it became that much more difficult for people to deny that they didn't know what had taken place during apartheid. Then and even now, it's common for white people to say, well, I didn't know what was happening. The fact that we had a truth commission makes that claim a little less credible. The commission also, from time to time, was criticised for not observing procedural fairness, and some perpetrators went to court, and the court ordered the commission to observe strict procedural fairness, which I think is absolutely crucial in any investigation and commission process. And essentially, the commission was ordered to ensure that before findings were made, if they were adverse findings, that the individuals involved had an opportunity to respond to those findings, and the Commission was required to consider those responses seriously. Did the Commission establish national reconciliation? After all, that was one of its key objectives, and the short answer is no. Frankly, to expect a Commission that is around for a short time period, most inquiries only last 2 or 3 years, to expect it to deliver national reconciliation is an unrealistic proposition. The best that the South African Commission did was to offer a framework for national reconciliation to develop going forward. And frankly, we're still working on that. We still have a long way to go. Did the amnesty, the Truth for Amnesty, deliver much truth? Now that's an important question, because many of my colleagues and comrades will always say we needed this amnesty to deliver the truth. My own view is that we didn't get that much truth out of the Truth for Amnesty process. Now, why didn't we? You know, you would think that if perpetrators were being offered immunity and all they had to do was speak the full truth, that they would want to come forward in a cathartic display of compassion, contrition, and engage in an act of reconciliation by placing the full truth on the table. And you saw from the figures that I provided you a little while back that this really didn't happen. And even if you look at the people who came forward, there were very few senior perpetrators, very few senior officers, very few senior politicians. A couple of exceptions here and there, but by and large they stayed away. Why did they stay away? And the reason is, perpetrators are by and large not the kind of people who want to come forward and speak for the sake of it. Generally speaking, perpetrators only come forward to speak the truth if they really have to, and they only really have to if you've got something on them. So what we discovered was that, particularly security officers, if we were investigating them and they were aware that we had gathered evidence and that a case was imminent, a prosecution was going to happen, they came forward. And what did they tell us? They only told us what they knew we had in our investigation files. So if you think that you're just going to adopt a truth for amnesty process and there's going to be this outpouring of truth and some cathartic, explosive display, it's unlikely to happen. By and large, they're going to tell you what you know already. All right, I'm going to finish off by talking about follow-up. Did we keep our promises to victims in terms of justice and reparations? And sadly, the answer to both those questions is in the negative. Let me deal with accountability and justice first. If we were serious about the design that we had set up, we would have put together a very serious investigative and prosecutorial approach together with our Truth Commission, but we didn't do that. We simply had the old unreformed police service with the old unreformed prosecutors and the old unreformed judiciary. We sort of expected these institutions to somehow deliver justice. Needless to say, that didn't happen. I was involved in an ad hoc investigation, and we had to, although President Mandela provided our investigation with sufficient independence to allow us to find the evidence, we then had to give that evidence to prosecutors who were the old apartheid prosecutors, who in turn had to put that evidence before the old judges, many of whom, or in those days, all of whom, were whites and mostly male, and mostly dyed-in-the-wool apartheid types. There were some exceptions. And the cases that we developed went before these individuals, and most of them failed, unsurprisingly. Cases that were refused amnesty were meant to be at least investigated. We didn't expect prosecutions in every single case. I'm sorry to say that less than a handful have been taken forward, even though the Commission highlighted 300 specific cases in which there was cogent evidence and in which the victims and communities were seeking justice. As we speak today, none of those cases are before the courts. None have been resolved. Nobody has been convicted for any of those crimes. That's a shocking indictment of that particular program. I've had to represent a number of victims who are seeking today, 30 years later, seeking justice. The state has even gone the extra mile to further promote impunity. They've even tried to introduce the amnesty process into the prosecutorial program by expanding the grounds upon which a prosecutor can decline to take a case forward. We had to go to court and have that struck down. Just in the past few years, we also had to go to court to strike down a new program of impunity, namely that of political pardons, which completely excluded victims from any participation. And today we're now looking at private prosecutions in order to take some of these cases forward. In terms of reparations, the story is equally bleak. The Truth Commission recommended a coherent program of both individual and collective reparations. Oh, I see. I'm told that mic is running out of battery. I might be running out of battery time too. Yes, sadly, when it comes to reparations, notwithstanding the interim constitution and its postscript, which said that victims must be given reparations, their harm must be redressed, we have completely failed reparation, at least victims in that regard. All that's happened is a once-off pro rata payment of around $3,000 per victim that took place in around 2000. It was only made to individuals who were lucky enough to see a statement taker before the Truth Commission, and that payment was made regardless of the nature of the harm suffered. If somebody was picked up and slapped around a little for a couple of minutes, he or she got the same payment as somebody else who might have lost a breadwinner, who had their home destroyed, and who lost their entire livelihood. And again, today, myself and others are engaged in an ongoing battle with government to meet up to their obligations to pay reparations. So far, they have simply closed the door on victims. They've turned their backs on the very people who sacrificed so much for South Africa's new democracy. So, in conclusion, yes, there was something of a miracle that helped us to secure a transition to a democracy that today we enjoy. However, to my mind, it's a blemished process with many faults and drawbacks. The main one being the fact that this celebrated program that is trumpeted around the world as a model of transition has unforgivably trashed tens of thousands of victims who gave so much for South Africa's democracy. And in so doing, it really has demeaned South Africa's transition and added considerably to the trauma of the victims who have already suffered so much. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.